Recently, a lot of viewers have been reaching out and asking me about my turkey setup, what it takes to actually run turkeys on your homestead or your home. How are they different than chickens? Are they harder than chickens? Are they easier than chickens? What do you need to feed them? What kind of shelter do you need for them? How much land do you need? What's the fencing situation like? So I thought, with Thanksgiving right around the corner, what better time to walk through my turkey setup and show you what you need to run turkeys on your homestead or home. I love turkeys. We've been running turkeys now for several years. I'll cut to the chase. They're easy. In fact, I'd say they're probably easier than our chickens in a lot of ways, as long as you keep a few key things in mind. So we'll go over everything that you need to get going with turkeys if you're interested in that. I think you might be surprised at how easy it is. Now that we've been raising turkeys for, 3 years now, I've developed a list of pros and cons associated with raising turkeys, and I think the list of pros far outweighs the cons. Just off the top of my head, the pros include things like the fact that they're very friendly animals, not aggressive at all. They'll come right up to you and hang out with you whenever you're walking around the pasture. They're largely predator-proof. Predators aren't terribly interested in them. We've lost dozens of chickens to various predators over the years. We haven't lost any turkeys, at least off the top of my head. I don't remember ever losing any turkeys to predators once. They also provide a lot of high quality meat. We love the taste of turkey. We prefer it to chicken. But when you process a turkey, you get a lot more meat than you do with a chicken. And I could keep going with the pros. The cons, there are a few. It's a little bit more involved when you're processing them. They are heavier. That makes slaughtering them and processing them a little bit more involved. But by and large, like I said, the pros of owning turkeys and raising turkeys far outweigh the cons. I personally think it's better if you have some experience with chickens and you've started with chickens before you get into turkeys, but it's absolutely not necessary. Like I said earlier, I do believe that turkeys are probably easier than chickens in many ways. So if you just want to skip chickens and go straight to turkeys, by all means, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. I just think that if you're new to dealing with animals, chickens are a good kind of white belt, basic 101 animal husbandry on a homestead. Dealing with chickens is the easiest thing. At least for us, it's been. So if you have some familiarity with chickens, you might be able to take that next step into turkeys. And that actually leads me to a very important disclaimer. There are some areas where chickens and turkeys shouldn't be kept together because chickens can spread a disease to turkeys. I think it's called blackhead. I'd have to double check the name. I'm pretty sure it's called blackhead though, where they'll make turkeys very sick if they live in the same pen. We don't happen to live in one of those areas. Our chickens and turkeys obviously have been living just fine together with no problems. But there are some locales where it's not advisable. And in situations like that, I would recommend having a separate run for turkeys, just to keep that risk at bay. We actually have a separate run for our meat chickens, and it's really not a big deal to keep two different flocks. It doesn't require that much additional work. So having a separate run for a different species of poultry or a different type of poultry really isn't a huge lift if you have the room for it. Check online to see if there's any reports of blackhead or any chicken to turkey diseases in your area, or even better yet, go to a local farm store or co-op and ask people that might be familiar, or a farmer's market, and people that are selling chickens and turkeys. Ask them. They should have a pretty good idea of whether or not it's an issue in your area. All right, very first question. Where do you get your turkeys? How do you source turkey chicks? And the answer to this one is easy. The same places that you get your chicken chicks from. The best bet in all situations is try to source as local as possible, as often as possible. If you know farmers locally or homesteaders locally that raise chickens and turkeys, ask them first. There's a good chance that they may have some to offload or sell to you. Now, if you're not getting any luck on that front, well, then just check your local farm stores. If you've got a local co-op or even one of the big national chains like Rural King or Tractor Supply, oftentimes in the spring they'll sell chicken chicks, but you'll usually see a little stock tank with turkey chicks in it as well. That's another good place to buy them. And then, of course, the chick by mail outfits, Murray McMurray, Meyer Hatchery, there's a few others. They'll sell you whatever breed of turkey chicks that you would want, and they can mail them to you, and they'll get there within 1 or 2 days, and then you'll have your chicks ready to go. Now, how do you keep turkey chicks? Again, the answer is it's the same as keeping chicken chicks. We have a brooder set up here. Right now we're using it to store food, but when we have chicks, we'll turn this whole situation into a chick brooder with a heat lamp or a heating pad in there, and it works great for both chicken chicks and turkey chicks. I'll include a link to a video that goes over our setup just so you can kind of get a good sense of how we raised our turkey chicks. But again, it's very similar to raising chickens. The one thing I'll say that's slightly different is obviously they get bigger. And so when they're teenagers and you want to keep them separate from the flock, it's my advice to have a separate little penned-in area to quarantine them before you release them into the greater flock, whether it's other turkeys or other chickens, and I'll show you that real quick. So I built this A-frame several years ago for moving meat chickens. It's actually mobile, it's got some wheels on it, and I've moved meat chickens around the pasture. But for the past few years, I've kind of been using this as a quarantine area, the brig for turkeys or chickens or chicks. So what I'll typically do is I will outfit this area with food, water, and keep chicks, whether they're turkey chicks or chicken chicks, in this area until they're big enough to kind of fend for themselves and go out among the greater flock, the general population. But this is convenient for me, and this is what I do just to keep them kind of away from the rest of the flock. If you don't have access to a separate area like this, it's not hard. Even getting some fencing and just having one section of paddock or barnyard for your main flock and another section for your turkey chicks would be fine. Or building a smaller tractor, that's something you can do as well. Here's an example of a small poultry tractor that I made a few years back. This one's kind of cumbersome and a pain to move around, but this is another kind of great area to keep chicks or chickens or anybody that you want separate from the main flock. This one wasn't hard at all to build. Again, I think I made this several years ago, and this is a very easy setup. So at the very least, if you need to keep those chicks separate, having something like this is a good call. One other thing to note about turkey chicks, if you get really into turkeys, you won't need to source them at all. You can breed them on your own, breed and incubate them on your own. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a bit, but for now, it's just good to know that wherever you get regular chicken chicks, there's a good chance you'll be able to get turkey chicks as well. Now, how much land do you need? Let's say you have anywhere from 2 to 6 turkeys, which I think is a reasonable amount of turkeys if you're just starting out. We personally have this 1/4 acre paddock, this 1/4 acre barnyard, the yard that comes in off of the barn, and it's more than enough for all of our turkeys and all of our chickens. Total, we've had upwards of 30 birds in just this 1/4 acre alone. You could get by with 1/10 of an acre. As long as you are keeping fairly constant source of carbon, we like to use straw or hay. You could also use things like mulch and turn that over frequently because birds do poop a lot. So if you're refreshing the run with things like straw and hay on a regular basis, you should be fine. The smaller amount of land that you have, the more often you'll need to refresh this carbonaceous diaper, as some folks like to call it. But if you have a bigger paddock, this doesn't need to be refreshed as much, just because the birds have more room to roam. Like I said, we use straw or hay. You can also use things like leaves. Birds love rooting through the leaves. And if it's big enough, the vast majority of your barnyard or your paddock can just be pasture like this. And this is more than enough room for our birds to roam around. A lot of people also use mobile chicken tractors or turkey tractors, and they just move their turkeys around on pasture. That's another option, albeit a labor-intensive option. You need to be out there moving them once, probably twice a day. We did that with meat chickens. There's a lot of folks that do love the mobile way of doing things and putting their turkeys in a mobile tractor and moving it around pasture. If you've got the pasture to do that, I would suggest at least an acre of fresh pasture. Then by all means, look into building a turkey tractor and just moving them around and keeping them in that tractor. And that way you don't need to worry about things like fencing, which we'll get into next. Now, fencing for turkeys is an interesting topic for several reasons, and I'll just start with the first kind of tragic incident that we had with our turkeys on the homestead. It was a few years ago. We had a big tom turkey. I think this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we had this fencing that you see behind me, this Premier One electrical fencing, which you can charge and provide a shock that goes through it. And we kept it on all day, and One day I went out to discover that my big tom turkey had gotten stuck in the electric fence, and I was gone. I was away for the entire day, so he had been stuck there for hours, and eventually the electric shock killed him. We just had a big dead bird on our hands, and it had been several hours, so the flies had already started getting into him. So it was just it was unfortunate. It was a tragedy. It was a waste. And so ever since then, we haven't lit up our electric fence unless it was at night. So there's a couple of things to consider. The first is that unless you clip their wings, turkeys can fly. They actually have very good flight abilities. Before I clipped these guys' wings, you'll remember a few episodes ago, we were dealing with our turkeys flying all the way up in all of these trees all around this pasture. They just flew all the way to the trees, and we had one turkey that was gone for several days before she returned. So in terms of actually keeping the turkeys in, the fence isn't going to do much unless you clip their wings. Now, clipping their wings is relatively easy. I'll show you some footage of the last time we clipped their wings. We had some of our escaped turkeys come in and we clipped their wings. It's pretty easy to do. When they're bigger, you do kind of have to wrestle them. I'll put that on the cons list. That is something that is tougher with these birds, is wrestling them down and catching them to clip their wings. I would recommend that you clip their wings, because once their wings are clipped, they'll generally respect the physical border of a fence. This fence isn't on, obviously I'm touching it. If they have their food and they have their water and they have their perching place, they really won't have any reason to try and escape the confines of this physical barrier. We don't run electricity through this fence anymore because we don't really need to. The chickens and the turkeys stay in bounds. They don't fly over it. Occasionally, we'll wake up in the morning and one of the chickens who roosts way up in that tree has landed on the other side, and I have to lower the fence to let them in. But this fence doesn't come on at all during the day, and occasionally at night when we've been dealing with predators. Right now, we're not in a predator season. We're not dealing with predators. This fence is a purely physical border. I would recommend it if you have turkeys to have some sort of fencing, whether it's just netting like this, or you get something like cattle panel or hog panel. Even chain link fencing would work as a border around your chicken run or your turkey run. But something, my suggestion for those starting out is to start with something easy like poultry fencing from Premier One. It's relatively idiot proof. Sometimes it can be hard to untangle this and move it around, but if you want a quick paddock, get something like this and make sure you clip those turkeys' wings. Another thing I'll say is that when you take a step back, why do you even have fencing in the first place? Not only is it to keep your animals in, but it's to keep predators out. And I just mentioned predators a minute ago. One of the pros with turkeys is that we've never dealt with predators. They're too big and unwieldy and too much of a pain in the butt for the most part for predators to want to mess with them, at least when they're fully grown and mature. When they're younger, it is a little bit more of a risk, and that's why I've kept them in that A-frame when they're younger until they're bigger. When you have a turkey this size, if you see a hawk flying over, it's generally not interested. A raccoon, generally not interested. Now, if you're in an area that has things like bears or larger predators, bobcats, things like that, yes, that is something you need to be concerned about, and that is a factor when you're deciding what fence to use. But if you're not dealing with those larger predators, if all you're dealing with is skunks and raccoons, they're not really interested in turkeys. Shelter is definitely an area where turkeys are easier than chickens. For as long as we've raised turkeys, they've never, ever wanted to go inside any sort of structure. They've always preferred to sleep outside. Now, as you can imagine, that makes building their shelter relatively easy. A couple months ago, I built this roost house, this roost arbor, whatever you want to call it, this roost tower for my turkeys, and by and large they've used it, not all the time, but between them and the chickens they will use this. And this is a very simple structure to build. I based this off of Justin Rhodes' turkey coop. I kind of put my own twist on it. It's easy to find plans for things like this. I'll include a link to the build out if you want to get a sense for how I built this. But even this is kind of gilding the lily a little bit. This is over providing for turkeys. It actually doesn't need to be this complicated. It could be a lot more simple than this to provide for the roosting habits of turkeys. It seems like our turkeys prefer to roost up here. And as you can see, this is just a 2x4 that I've stuck up between two poles. Now, obviously we have the roof overhead, the lean-to, but this was ridiculously easy to build. I just bought some of these little handles and put one each on these bars, stuck a 2x4 in, called it a day. They love it. And I also built a ladder out, a roosting ladder with logs for roosting spots, and they'll sleep on that as well. But that's it. That's all I had to do for them. Here's a traditional chicken coop. This is a Justin Rhodes style coop, and the chickens will often sleep in here at night. We can close the door if we want to. The turkeys will never go in here. Occasionally Laverne will come in here to lay an egg. We'll talk about egg laying here in a minute. But by and large, they never come in here at all. Continuing in that vein of ultra simple roosting places, I cut down some saplings, stuck in some lag bolts on some posts in the tree, and this is another roosting point for the turkeys. They love to roost here or even up in the tree. If you have just 2 posts that you can string a beam together, that's literally all you'll need. They'll often sleep out here under the open air without even a roof on their head. Unlike chickens, you don't need a coop. Now, if you have a shed or something that you can convert into a chicken coop, and it's tall enough and you put some roosting perches in there, the turkeys will probably go in there. However, you don't need it. Our turkeys prefer to sleep outside. They love the open air. They don't go in the coop. So that's all there is to it. I think if you're looking for some way to provide shelter for your turkeys, I think a good bet would be to start with something like this roost tower, whatever you want to call it. Again, I'll include a link to how I built this out, but this was really simple. This took me a few hours to build, a couple of 2x4s. If you don't have anything else, this is something, I think I spent less than $70 to build this. It was cheap. It wasn't expensive. And the turkeys will roost on something like this. Definitely something in the pro column when it comes to turkeys versus chickens. Now, food and water, you can probably guess what I'm about to say. Same thing as chickens. For our water, we supply all of our water needs to all of our birds, all of our poultry, with this metal fount and this rubber tray. This is very easy to refill for all of our birds. And in terms of food, the food that we feed them, we actually go with an all-flock pellet. It's a higher protein bird food, poultry food, that you can get anywhere you get chicken food. So your Co-op, Tractor Supply, Rural King, wherever you get your regular chicken food, you can typically find it's usually called all-flock feed, and it usually has a picture of chickens and turkeys and ducks, and any sort of bird can eat it. Now, if you only have access to chicken food or chicken pellets, laying pellets, that's fine too. There's been months when we didn't have access to anything but regular chicken laying pellets or chicken laying crumbles, and turkeys did just fine on that as well. So whatever you feed chickens, by and large, you can also feed turkeys as well. We like to mix in some stuff. Occasionally we'll mix in corn or black sunflower seeds, but it's very simple. You don't need to overthink the food and water situation with turkeys. They're almost like little pigs in a way, because we'll often feed them our scraps and our leftovers from the kitchen, which they'll go bananas for. So in a way, they'll compost whatever extra food or leftovers or food that's not quite good for human consumption. They'll take it over and turn it into eggs or meat. Now, speaking of eggs, if you keep female turkeys long enough, typically past the point where you'd usually process them, they'll lay turkey eggs for you. Now, I've talked about turkey eggs in previous videos, and a lot of people have wondered how they're different from chicken eggs. They're not really different in terms of taste. They're bigger and their shells are thicker. But in terms of how they taste, the yolk and the egg white, it's the same as chicken eggs. Turkey hens will lay fairly reliably for you. We had a turkey hen, I think 2 years ago, where she'd lay 5 times a week with nice, big, hefty, thick-shelled eggs that tasted good. Now, in terms of what kind of nesting box that you'd need for them, it does need to be a little bit bigger. What I'd suggest for folks is just getting, at the very least, if you have chickens, you should have a setup in your coop or your mobile coop like this, where you'll often have room in these nesting boxes for chickens to go in and lay eggs, which, chickens can fit and lay their eggs. But there's often space underneath it as well, where turkeys will go in and lay their eggs. So when our turkeys are laying, they will come in and they'll lay in this space under here. One thing I'd suggest if you're really strapped for a place for a turkey to lay egg is just get one of these litter boxes, these closed litter boxes from your local pet store. And the turkeys will often go in there. It's very easy for them to go in there. It's private. It's big enough to fit their bigger bodies. Now, what about processing turkeys? And Lenny, don't worry, I'm never going to process you. Lenny's a pet. He's never going anywhere. He's going to be pampered. He's the king of this barnyard. But most of our turkeys, in fact, we've got 4 scheduled for processing in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Most of our turkeys will be processed for meat, and it's delicious meat as well, especially for those of you that like kind of darker meats. We love turkey meat. What's the processing situation like? Well, this falls into the con category. This is a little bit tougher than processing chickens. The equipment that you need is usually a little bit larger. I have a video where I go into the processing process of turkeys, and I'll include the link to that here. But suffice it to say, they're a little bit harder to wrangle because they're heavier. They're a little bit harder to process because you can't put them in the feather remover, the little automatic feather remover that you can use for chickens. You typically will need to pluck them by hand, but I do have hints on how to make that easier in that video. So again, I'll include a link to that video where I go over the processing process for turkeys. In the end, I think it's worth it just because of the amount of meat you get. It's more than chickens, and the type of meat. In our view, it's richer, it's darker, it's fattier than chicken meat, and we prefer it. So check that video out if you're interested in processing turkeys. We'll be doing our next turkey processing day probably after Thanksgiving in the next few weeks. In the meantime, we still do have plenty of turkey meat from our last processing session in our freezer that we'll be using for this upcoming Thanksgiving. It lasts a while. You can just keep it in the freezer and it'll fill up a freezer. If you process a few turkeys, you'll get a lot of meat from them. Our experience with turkeys has been great. They're by far my favorite animal on the homestead that we've raised. We've raised chickens, turkeys, and pigs. And by far, turkeys are my favorite. They're friendly. Lenny, as you can see here, he likes to hang out with me. If I walk to the other side of the field, he'll follow me and chatter with me when I'm talking too much. In many ways, he's like a pet, but they're also good for things like meat and eggs too. So if you really get into turkeys and fall in love with turkeys as much as we have, then you may want to think about breeding them out. And like chickens, it's fairly simple. If you have a sexually mature tom and sexually mature hens, they will lay fertilized eggs, and you can incubate them the same way that you'd incubate chicken eggs. I would say that you might want to find an incubator with space for a little bit larger eggs because their eggs are a little bit larger. Our current batch of turkeys we've gotten from our friends Jim and Kathy at Two Turtles Homestead. The way Kathy says it, she just woke up one day and discovered turkey chicks running around. They took care of the breeding process all on their own. And there may be a situation like that if you raise enough turkeys long enough where you'll find that one of your turkey hens goes broody and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of turkey chicks. I'd be pleasantly surprised if something like that happened here, but either way, I'm planning on incubating the next batch of turkey eggs that we get coming up in the spring. So we are going to be harvesting 4 turkeys, but Lenny will stick around, our main tom, and we'll have 2 hens, Laverne and another hen. And I'll collect Laverne and that other hen's eggs and start incubating them in the next year. Won't be a terribly complicated process. Nature and the birds and the bees takes care of most of that. And so we're excited about getting those turkeys in the next year. To all the people that asked, are turkeys hard? The answer is no, they're not. If you can do chickens, you can do turkeys without a problem. There are some complications when it comes to processing them, but the complications, I believe, are worth it. So thanks for reaching out to me and prompting this video. I hope it helps those of you who might be on the fence about turkeys. I say you should jump in and go for it. From all of us here at the Yosted, thanks for hanging out with us. And until we see you again, remember, as always, slowly, slowly.